I'm going to be reading Chapter 4 of Antoine Arjakovsky's What is Orthodoxy? A Genealogy of Christian Understanding. Chapter 4. The Definitions of Orthodoxy. Forward. Phenomenology of Orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is an equivocal term that deserves further analysis. At present, orthodox is popularly understood to be equivalent to conservative, whether one is a Jew or a Christian, a banker or a lawyer, from the left or from the right. An economist, for example, might be accused of professing unorthodox theories, meaning opinions that differ from common liberal teachings on market mechanisms. On the eve of the anniversary of the inauguration of François Mitterrand as president of the French Republic, the French media freely speculated about the fidelity, or lack thereof, of the party members to the socialist Doxa. Numerous ambiguities can also be observed in the usage of the concept of orthodoxy throughout history. Orthodox Jews claim to be faithful to the most ancient traditions of Judaism, but it was only in the early 19th century that the Reformed Jews introduced this term to refer to a distinct movement within Judaism. Note: the central point of reference for Orthodox Jews is fidelity to a chain of transmission of the Halakha, a code of rules established by oral tradition dating from the Talmud to present times, revealed to Moses and coming down to us through the composition of the Talmud and the subsequent commentaries. An Orthodox Jew is one who recognizes his duty to live according to the Halakha. In this context, the work of Isaac Halevi Rabinowitz, 1847 to 1914, a teacher at Vilnius, is considered orthodox, since it is based on the oral Torah. It should be noted that Jewish historical science as a whole differs from the Greek concept of history in that it develops a vision of time which is both circular and linear. Okay. Since the time of St. Paul, the term orthodox had been applied to Christians who recognized themselves as such, without necessarily the connotation of a conservative mentality. The reference to walking correctly in Galatians 2:14 could be considered the first appeal in the 1st century to the concept of Christian orthodoxy, although the word itself is not used. When I saw they were not walking in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of everyone. Clement of Alexandria took up this expression with the name orthotomia, a term taken from the book of Proverbs, where it has the meaning of making straight your paths, and alluding to Paul's letter to Timothy, 2 Timothy 2:15, where the apostle asks his disciple to handle aright the word of truth. This is the canon or rule of reading the scriptures, which must be understood consistently, or of conduct in the assemblies, which must respect the diversity of the gifts of the Spirit despite social or ethnic differences, that ensures the collective application of walking in line for the salvation of souls. As Alain Le Boulec writes, in the face of an ancient culture that favored the rejection of innovation, and despite the reputation that orthodoxy has acquired in modern times, the tradition of orthodoxy and its norms are originally innovative, and the work of interpretation is inherent in them. Orthodoxy is in reality always in a relationship of continuity, but it is constantly confronted with an internal tension between fidelity to tradition and creative commitment. Here, too, there is ambiguity. The boundaries of the path towards Christian truth do not necessarily correspond to identifiable historical realities. In applying the term Orthodox to Christians, no distinction is made between the orthodoxy of Greek Ukrainian Catholics and that of Nigerian Anglicans. Very often, including in academic work, people speak without sufficient regard to the definition of the term orthodoxy, of a return to the orthodoxy of the faith of Luther, of the orthodoxy of the Council of Trent, or of Hesychast's spirituality, as if there had been a disconnect between the word and the truth of the reality that it signifies. Moreover, since the 14th or 15th centuries, this term has been commonly associated with a specific religious confession. When orthodoxy is spelled with a capital O to designate a Christian confession which identifies its faith with a specific historical institutional reality, It refers to the Orthodox Church, or the communion of Orthodox churches, the heirs of the Eastern churches, which have now spread throughout the world. Here also, in public opinion, the Orthodox Church is often misunderstood or reduced to half-truths. It is common to speak of the lack of unity in the Orthodox world, in spite of the great degree of liturgical and doctrinal unity among the 274 million Orthodox Christians, of the various ways these churches became politically compromised during the 20th century, even though not all Orthodox believers reacted to totalitarian governments in the same way, of the exterior form of the Orthodox Church buildings, onion domes in Eastern Europe, but not in Asia Minor. Onion domes are characteristic of the Baroque churches of the Germanic Holy Roman Empire, of the iconostasis, or wall of icons separating the people from the clergy during the liturgy, but these did not always exist, and so forth. It is true that the Orthodox have a tendency to present themselves as the sole church to have preserved the Christianity of the first millennium, but as the Russian Orthodox philosopher Vladimir Soloviev mischievously remarked in his work A Short Tale of the Antichrist, at the end of time, the Antichrist will ironically offer the Orthodox an institute of Christian archaeology. This provoked a reaction from Olivier Clement. In archaeology, there is the arche, which designates what is fundamental and original, and which both goes beyond history and renders it fruitful. During the second millennium, the Orthodox Church assembled many councils, raised up witnesses and church fathers who were open to new approaches to the mystery. The historical notion of orthodoxy has often been reduced to a concept. Orthodoxy has consequently been opposed to heresy, understood as false doctrine. When the first volume of Histoire du Christianisme, a 14-volume work which appeared in France between 1990 and 2000, Alain de Belot, professor at l'École pratique des hautes études, published an article entitled Heterodoxy et Orthodoxy, in which he synthesizes the debate over this problem from Walter Bauer to H.D. Altendorf and Rowan Williams, arriving at the conclusion that it is necessary to abandon concepts of heresy and orthodoxy in the study of distant epochs. However, the whole question is to know where to situate the notion of orthodoxy in our conceptualizations. If it is understood in a purely sociological sense, doxa loses the meaning it had acquired historically. Orthodoxy designates more than a doctrine, more than the doctrine that a majority group imposes upon a minority. It is for this reason, ultimately, that Alain de Bouloc proposes using the term orthopraxis to indicate the intrinsic link between faith and the social, moral, and ritual practices of the primitive Christian communities. Yet this approach cannot be entirely satisfactory, for it sacrifices the essential dimension of glorifying knowledge implied in the notion of doxa in primitive Christianity. Moreover, Le Bouloc himself realizes that heresy, which he studies alongside orthodoxy, cannot be reduced to a sole meaning. This term has itself undergone an evolution. Derived from herome, which means to choose, heresis was translated into Latin by secta, from sequi, to follow. Looks like I missed a note up here, so I'm going to go back. Ritual practices of the primitive Christian communities. Note: the principal arguments Bouloc employs are the following. On the one hand, the notion of heresy is relatively recent. Prior to 150, it signified dissent. It was only in the time of Justin, around 150, that the term began to take on consistency, when a system of representations built up around it in order to condemn and exclude it. As for the terms orthodoxia and orthodoxos, it is only in the 4th century that they took on the full significance which corresponds to the concept of orthodoxy as specific regulation. At the beginning, rectitude was associated with actions such as walking correctly. On the other hand, it can be seen from the example of the conflict over the date of Easter that, in the 2nd century, there was still a care to avoid reducing the ecclesiastical norms to dogmatic assertions, without, however, falling into a confused relativism. back to here. In the 2nd century BC, it signified a philosophical system or a school of thought as opposed to an institutional school. In the Acts of the Apostles, at 517 and 15:5, the term is used by Luke to designate the different streams or variants of Judaism. Here, the French ecumenical translation of the Bible, TOB, for instance, speaks of the party of the Sadducees. The word takes on pejorative implications when Paul is accused of being the leader of the heresis of the Nazarenes, Acts 24, verse 6. This connotation is accentuated in the work of other Christian authors, such as Justin Martyr's Treatise Against All Heresies, circa 100 to 165, now lost but cited by Irenaeus of Lyons in his own book Against Heresies. Henceforth, the term heresy came to signify a partial truth or attitude which, affirmed in isolation, becomes an error. By the 4th century, though through a process of simplification, it had become synonymous with false doctrine. Finally, at a more epistemic level, orthodoxy refers to a larger extent to the truth of doctrines than to the institutions which profess them. In the philosophy of Parmenides, one of the meanings of doxa is a confused opinion concerning some aspect of reality as opposed to the right path leading to truth. Being that is. In contemporary philosophy and sociology, doxa is more associated with a network of values concerning certain aspects and elements of the reality signified. In his 1957 book, Mythologies, Roland Barthes highlighted this by contrasting the vague beliefs of doxa with epistemic and certain knowledge. For Pierre Bourdieu, doxic discourse, by transforming the nature of culture, is the fundamental disposition of ideology. He considers doxa to be the image that the bourgeoisie has of the world and in turn imposes on the world. Charles Greville tried to reconcile the two approaches by showing that doxa and episteme are in a dialectical relationship, since all doxa presents itself as episteme, and every set of structured knowledge contains an element of doxa. In all cases, the doxa is beyond language, but below the discourse on which it tacitly bases intercomprehension. Beyond language. Contemporary scholarship tends to emphasize the presence of doxic systems, which are characterized on the one hand vertically by axiologies, bipolar lines whose extremities are in mutual tension, and on the other hand by semantic fields. These systems represent ideologisms and reflect the internal organization of societies. In her work, Le Pèlerin et les Convertis, the sociologist of IHES in Paris, Danielle Herveau-Leger, has drawn upon the lessons of the finalities of inherited religious identification to propose a new systematic model which brings the new religious paths into tension. On this account, the definition of the concept of orthodoxy cannot be strictly conceptualized. Definitions may associate this term with faith, worship, knowledge, truth, tradition, or social practice. These definitions bestow on their terms, according to context, the qualifications correct, right, faithful, or just. Okay, I missed a couple of large notes. Okay, let's go back. So Charles Greville tried to reconcile the two approaches by showing that doxa and episteme are in a dialectic relationship, since all doxa presents itself as episteme and every set of structured knowledge contains an element of doxa. So that's here. According to Charles Greville, along with the semantic logical filtration of language, there is a social pre-comprehension based on preference and behavior. A social pre-comprehension based preference and behavior. For a message to be acceptable, it should be in conformity with the imperatives of transmission of comprehensibility, but also with the imperatives of utility and persuasiveness. This presupposes the sharing of some speech, of a same speech, of the same beliefs, i.e., a community of faith, between those who participate in the communication. So I think what he's implying is that language is layered and multifarious, and that there's always a sense in which the kind of not just the explicit presuppositions, but also the social presuppositions and the kind of sublinguistic or even supralinguistic characteristics of communication, the things that fall outside of dialectic, but necessarily condition people's interactions with one another in dialectic. That these things matter for conditioning whether or not particular explicit beliefs or statements are, whether they're epistemic or dogmatic, are accepted or rejected. It's not simply based on a kind of cold logic, but there's a kind of layering of meaning in which implicit communication is just as, if not more important than explicit communication, and like an implicit sense of belonging or belonging to a group is just as important for, if not more important for, the accepting of particular beliefs than the beliefs themselves, the relative truth value of those beliefs. That the truth you feel of those beliefs is connected to your sense of connection to a group that holds those beliefs. And that thus, like, without that community, there cannot be, those beliefs can't, they can't cohere, no matter how coherent they are. If there's no community around which to cohere them, those beliefs cannot be coherent. And so, I mean, he's right to identify that the kind of thoughts and attitudes and dispositions of particular milieus, I hate that word, it's so stupid, but particular groupings, classes of people, condition the possibilities for what those people can consider true or false. And so there probably is a dialectical tension between various groups, and that is based on more than just power games, but based on implicit communication due to, or lack thereof of communication due to, other levels of relation being out of alignment with one another in social interaction, such that, talking, like even for myself, talking to somebody of, let's make it as benign a situation as possible, like with the lowest level of truth, the lowest stakes, like sports, like the fact that I'm a wrestler leads me to communicate implicitly and explicitly differently at other levels. That, like, if somebody tries talking to me about wrestling that isn't a wrestler, I can sort of hold a conversation with them, but you can tell that they don't really understand, because there's so much more to that culture, to the culture of any sport, than words can say. It's subtle movements, etc. Anyway. Continue. I also missed another note down a little bit further. Okay. This person has drawn upon the lessons of the finalities of inherited religious identification to propose a systematic model which brings the new religious paths into tension. This model, which illustrates the disconnection in France between faith and community membership, can be applied to other European countries. Anyway, it's a short note. I didn't need to read that one. Let's see. Okay, these definitions bestow on their terms, according to the context, the qualifications correct, right, faithful, or just. These variations and imprecisions are reinforced by an important historical fact. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek around 270 BC by the Septuagint, the Jewish word kabod, commonly meaning glory, was translated by the Greek doxa, with opinion as one of its meanings. 14. In the New Testament, the kabod, Yahweh, becomes the doxa to theo, which doxa tau theo. We will return later to this major semantic leap. However, we can propose a preliminary definition of orthodoxy on a general epistemological level, incorporating the historical evolution of the concept. The term orthodoxy is distinct from that of truth when the latter refers merely to the ability of human intelligence to arrive at the truth deductively. Orthodox thought reflects true thought when the logical discernment of reason adds to the expression of truth a decision of adherence from the personal conscience, that is, of the inner voice of the individual. For this conscience to be able to express its judgment without falling into arbitrariness, there are at least two conditions which must be present and which can potentially exclude one another. The conscience must be totally free, in the sense of independent, capable of making its own judgment, but it must also be connected to a community, a repository of knowledge, and specific memory, which produces fields of communication. The orthodox definition of the orthodox truth, therefore, is not situated purely on the level of individual conviction and intuition. Orthodoxy in the end is a journey, a way of life, mediated through a community in space and time, which symbolically formulates and precisely transmits its experience of truth in a grateful, rational, and faithful way. The history of thought bears witness to two major attempts, philosophical and theological, to further define this experience of the truth. So I'll just stop and comment here again, thinking back to the trivial analogy of the wrestling with connection to myself. The same is probably true of orthodoxy. That's why probably somebody who is a cradle orthodox and also a priest who's deeply orthodox in all sorts of ways that are subtle and communicated at those other levels aside from explicit speech, can spot a convert from a mile away, myself being one as well. That there's probably ways of thinking and speaking and acting that even if I'm using all the right words, I really am a guest in the house of another, in a culture that's not my own, and I'm constantly making mistakes, or rather, I'm constantly operating according to both sublinguistic and superlinguistic intuitions that probably come from my history of spiritual formation in other traditions, whether it's Pentecostalism or Anglicanism, or those are the two main ones. But that I'm no matter how much I thought like an Orthodox person in terms of explicit theological beliefs during the periods in which I was formed spiritually in other contexts, that I wasn't truly Orthodox, because Orthodoxy is a life. It's the way, the truth, and the life. Is who Christ is, and my history of formation and other areas, even if it didn't inhibit me from drawing closer in certain thought patterns to orthodoxy, it didn't, over 12 years or however long it was, it didn't actually make me orthodox, because all of those other cues, social and otherwise, give me away. The philosophical definition of truth. Truth is not just an aspect of knowledge. It is, above all, a transcendental qualification of being as such. In 1952, the Swiss Catholic philosopher and theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar published an important work entitled Phenomenologie de la Vérité. In this study, he demonstrates that, for the Christian tradition of the East and the West, the reduction of knowledge to truth, of knowledge of truth to purely theoretical knowledge, independently of vital decisions individuals are led to take when confronted by it, deprives the truth of its universality and true nature. This is good. Truth is integral, vital, and existential. This is why, unlike the perception of truth which marks modern rationalism, in the ancient tradition the spheres of good and beauty cannot be radically dissociated from that of truth. These aspects cannot be rejected on account of private faith or individual taste. In order to rediscover the truth in the post-rationalist sense of the term, I don't like that term, but rationality matters, even if it's a lower angel. There is need of a method, of criteria which enable us to formulate and evaluate judgments. This method is precisely what the history of philosophy has designated by the term orthodoxy. Orthodoxy as a method. Von Balthasar defines his method in phenomenological language, which is my wheelhouse. Describe the truth of the world by emphasizing above all what makes it belong to the world without, however, excluding the possibility that the truth thus described may contain in itself certain elements directly derived from a divine supernatural origin. This method is rooted in two major characteristics attributed to revealed truth throughout the history of thought, namely its capacity of self-revelation and its trustworthiness. In the tradition of ancient Greece, the truth is an element of being revealed, not hidden, aletheia, whereas in the biblical tradition the truth is also emeth, fidelity, consistency, something worthy of confidence. For von Balthasar, truth thus defined puts an end to uncertainty through the evidence of the unveiled gift, which offers a way of access to a myriad of new understandings. The relationship of humanity with truth, however, has a history which must henceforth be taken into consideration through the narrative of the orthodoxy of truth. In modern rationalism, truth is understood as the abstract conformity of the idea with its object, as the adequacy of what one says or thinks with what is real, or what can be proven. Such modern definitions of truth are not without consequences. For the Russian thinker Sergius Bulgakov, the modern individualistic representation of truth is doomed to establish arbitrary, one-sided, and therefore heretical decisions in the etymological sense of the term. In his major work, La Tragédie de la Philosophie, written in the early 1920s, Bulgakov defined the relationship between philosophical thought and truth as a tragedy insofar as it seeks to disregard the relation of commitment that exists between the individual and the world. Interesting. The antinomies that devastate reason are those very ones which constitute and define it. The critical antinomianism in metaphysics and epistemology thus takes the place of dogmatic rationalism. This latter is only the infatuation of the reason with itself. Criticism, on the contrary, consists precisely in questioning the structures of reason and its foundations, not in order to overthrow it, but rather to affirm it. In light of this criticism, the history of philosophy is merely a tragic history of heresies. Bulgakov bases his opinion on the following argument. The person who wants to arrive at truth should first affirm himself as a conscious being who declares, "I am this someone." Cogito. But this movement of the consciousness is based on antinomies. Indeed, the I cannot be objectivized and is absolute, whereas the predicate, this someone, both determines and objectivizes it. So it's two things that are opposed to one another, the I and the objectification of the I. This reality violates two basic principles of logical reasoning, namely the principle of identity and the principle of non-contradiction. Principle of identity and principle of non-contradiction. I'm actually liking this book more and more. And leads to the idealist philosophy of J.G. Fichte, which is characterized by the never-realized desire to attain awareness of the infinite. Similarly, the predicate, this someone, which represents the conceptual determination, the idea of the nature, requires the totality and universality of the logos. This is the meaning of Hegel's philosophy, conceived as a philosophy of the predicativity of being. Such a philosophy leads to an unbearable tension between the relative and the absolute. Moreover, in reality, the verb to be signifies neither consciousness nor nature. The copula M is divided in two, one and multiple, motionless and mobile. We find here the instability of the monist pantheistic systems, which deny the distinction between subject and predicate, of Leibniz and Spinoza, and the philosophy of the absolute without distinction of the philosophy of mythology and of the revelation of Schelling. According to Bulgakov, in these three cases, human thought seeks to reduce the three terms to just one. The human mind, however, fails to reveal itself as subject in the predicate, because there is no complete identity between the three moments of judgment of self-determination. Bulgakov concludes that philosophy must become critical of itself, that it must recognize an absolute spirit within which the three irreducible moments of the life of the spirit are reconciled. Pierre Hadot, 1922 to 2010, a colleague of Michel Foucault's at the Collège de France, wrote an enthusiastic review of Bulgakov's book. He sums up the Russian philosopher's position in these terms. The dogma of the unitrinity appears as a unique outcome, postulated by the human spirit but inaccessible without revelation. What reason postulates, when it becomes aware of its own enigma as an absolute spirit in which the self-revelation of the self's exhaustive, that is, in which the self-determination of the predicate is not a non-self imposed from without or some pure idealistic construct, but the I myself, going out of itself into another oneself, in a relationship in which I myself would experience the unity of self to self in a copular being which, in turn, would have the fullness of personal consciousness. In other words, there is need of a self which is at the same time being and logos, a logos which is simultaneously self and being, and all this within the unity of a sole self-affirmation of the self. Thus, for Bulgakov, the Trinitarian dogma enlightens reason and enables it to discover itself. This reminds me of Pavel Ferenczi. This implies an important consequence. Philosophy, which is heterodox at a certain level of sapiental tension, must tend towards Christian orthodoxy if it is to avoid modalist systemism and realize its quest for truth. Conversely, for him, theology can only be sapiental. It cannot include the divine unity in an abstract and impersonal manner, and it must not fall into the heresies of monarchism or pluralist Arianism. The consubstantiality of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit is the light of the truth which shines over the human sciences of the future. Even though many aspects of Bulgakov's analysis have become unacceptable in contemporary academic circles, probably because of these circles' abstract and fragmented representation of knowledge and their highly specialized organization of scholarship, one finds among certain thinkers a renewed interest for any thought associating the transcendental with the empirical, which is what Christianity does. In 2003, the French philosopher Marcel Gauchet proposed his transcendental anthroposociology. In his book La Condition Historique, the director of the magazine Les Débats no longer talks of expelling the religious element from sociology, as many are wont to do, but attempts to understand the evolution of the religious structurings of societies. Not all religions are created equal. For Gauchet, societies are dependent on a gift, donation, and it is precisely this which enables them to have power over themselves, from which it follows that humans are not political animals, as Aristotle would have it. Rather, what distinguishes them from the animals is that their political consciousness enables them to invent ways of being together. Gauchet concludes that religion is the means by which the social person relates to the self. At this juncture, our reflection should focus on the distinction between being oneself and being together. Thus, for Gauchet, the symbolic language is before us. It is characterized by the ternary movement of self-awareness, by the distance in relation to oneself, and by the rediscovery of self through externality. The theological definition of truth. Well, first, before I read this, I think it's important. I haven't read Phenomenology in quite a while, but basically it's usually elucidating some aspect of experience. If this is a phenomenology of understanding of orthodoxy, then it's attempting to circle in. It takes as a premise that any, like through analysis of one's experience of the thing, or like the collocation of experiences of the thing, you can circle in through, at an approximation of what is this phenomenon to which you apply the term orthodoxy. And so that can be a really frustrating experience because it's not something you can kind of shortcut. You can't analytically go straight to the answer with phenomenology, because phenomenology requires you to ride a hermeneutical spiral that spirals in on a subject matter. And so that can be really frustrating for the analytically oriented person. But it also just so happens that this is phenomenology more accurately approximates the experience that people have in conversion to something. That you can do a phenomenology of conversion itself, but conversion itself follows a kind of phenomenological path often. Very rarely are people converted to something because, somebody, slam dunk them with a logic bomb. They have to be converted at sublinguistic and superlinguistic levels. Basically, levels that are beyond speech because they're ineffable, because they're in some way connected to beauty, goodness, and truth, and beyond that to God, or because of a kind of assimilation into the cultural forms that then unlock the meaning of the terms. And so you'll read, I hate French phenomenologists, but partly because I didn't want to believe what they believed, but like the way in which they read or the way in which they wrote, like Derrida, was impenetrable unless you adopted their linguistic frame of reference and their kind of manner or mode of being, which is noxious to me. And so, but that's what they welcome you into. Like a phenomenologist is welcoming you to adopt a hermeneutic, a language, and then from there they can then kind of weave a spell around you of meaning from within that particular local context, and kind of elucidate things to you through both giving you experiences and also connecting your own experiences to the experiences they're trying to elucidate with their language. And so so that's what I'm getting from this, is that some of the language seems impenetrable, but once you've put it on, you begin to see what the author is trying to do, and what he's trying to lead you into, which is a sense of the truth as something, the truth that is apprehendable in orthodoxy in its fullness, as constitutive of a life, an entire life, which includes all the elements hitherto discussed, but that truth itself is not, it's not non-rational, but the truth is all encompassing, and rationality only is capable of elucidating with clarity a very small segment of reality that is incredibly limiting on the human person, that it kind of narrows the hermeneutical frame to basically that which can be delineated in language analytically, without the need to make the things that you're saying correspondent with those other levels or layers of meaning in life, and truth in life. That is a form of knowledge that, frankly, human beings can't have. You can't have a disembodied form of knowledge. And so the entire epistemological project of how do we know what we know is knowledge, how do we know what we know is true, is for the most part foreign to the human experience. That we understand far more than we know. Because understanding something, the phenomenology of understanding something is something you can delineate. You can do a hermeneutical, you can do a phenomenological analysis of understanding and circle in on what it means for someone to go, oh, I got it. I understand. I truly understand now. And you can come up with a criterion for what constitutes true understanding of something. Whereas very few things in life that matter, that we can understand, rise to the level of what the rationalist wants to limit all truth claims to. And so orthodoxy, in kind of encompassing the entirety of a life lived in orientation to Christ through the multifarious interactions we have with others, where we're getting everything we need from a single source, even if it's encountered in a myriad of faces, not in the kind of Hindu sense of every man is God, but rather the God who is beyond being, that his, like, from that place that you see, you begin to see all of your interactions with everyone around you as marked or imprinted with the life of the Trinity, in the very structure of relationships, the fact that relationships are indeed relational, that knowledge itself is something relational. Sorry, those are my thoughts at that point. But to continue on, we'll go to his definition of truth, and I'm becoming more and more amenable, or these ideas are becoming more and more amenable to my very idiosyncratic sensibilities. The theological definition of truth. The history of Christian theology has led us to a contemporary definition of truth which is no longer homogeneous. According to the textbooks of dogmatic theology, the truth is first of all what has been defined by the magisterium. Well, that's Catholic. What is in conformity with the scriptures, or what is faithful to the traditions of the ecumenical councils. In spite of these rather schematic distinctions between Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox traditions, Christians share a common vision of the truth as a person. Yeah. Which, if the truth is a person, that means it's someone manifesting all those characteristics. Not just the explicit statements, but the phronema, the way of being that Christ communicates to his disciples is just as important to the gospel as the explicit speech acts. That he is the Word, he's the living Word of God, and that includes all of those levels of relationship: subtle, sublinguistic, superlinguistic, metaphysical, material, all of it. As a whole is the truth that Christ embodies in himself and in his death and resurrection. For them, Jesus Christ is the hodos, that is, the way of truth and the way of life. In the Christian metahodology of orthodoxy, there cannot be anything that is true without life. Nor life which does not aspire to truth. Furthermore, in this tradition of thought, truth cannot be possessed because it is a person. One can only belong to it. It is a gift inseparable from love. One can belong to the truth. This is why orthodoxy situates itself between faith, this disposition to live in God, whom it seeks to serve by incarnation, and reason, which is its spiritual rudder. Faith is professed only insofar as it is demonstrated. The doctrine of faith is thus edification of meaning and meaning interpretation. Orthodox Christian rationality implies, according to its tradition of scriptural interpretation, a relation and communal joining of people to Jesus Christ, who is, in the Christian tradition, the Logos incarnate. In this sense, orthodoxy signifies the adequacy of faith and of reason, an accomplishment of rationality which attains the universal and the actualization of an encounter which gives the meaning to it all. The adequacy of faith and reason, an accomplishment of rationality. According to Christian doctrine, orthodoxy cannot be conceived as a static reality, something closed and finished. It is originally, then it wouldn't be something that preaches theosis, if that were the case. It is originally a journey in the way opened by Christ. In patristic thought, orthodoxy appears where the Holy Spirit breathes. And it is always in continuity with the evangelical and apostolic tradition, insofar as its task is to bring the divine nature and human nature together. The function of orthodox thought is to bear witness to this encounter or to show the paths that lead to it, which requires defending against heresies, because heresies are the things that break the connection between the divine and human nature. Heresies disrupt connection between divine and human. This can be translated into the discovery of the laws of the created universe, the teaching of spiritual truths, the guidance of people in their daily lives, the celebration of an exchange of gifts, in short, by all that can lead human beings to tend, individually and collectively, toward the kingdom of God, which is the plenitude, pleroma, of orthodoxy. This is why the notion of personal consciousness, both individual and collective, is essential in determining orthodoxy. Orthodox thought, in the confessional sense of the term, as used by the School of Paris to designate a group of thinkers who worked mostly at the St. Sergius Institute and at the Put Review, has borrowed the concept of conscience from the German philosophy. The School of Paris reworked this concept in the light of the Eastern tradition with the understanding that it was fundamentally Catholic and conciliatory and not a self-consciousness returned in on itself. In L'Image et la Ressemblance de Dieu, Vladimir Lossky defines Catholicity of Consciousness as follows. The mystery of the Catholicity of the Church is realized in the plurality of personal consciousness as agreement of unity and multiplicity in the image of the Holy Trinity, which the Church realizes in its own life. 3 consciences, a unique subject, a sole divine counsel, or council of the saints, which is the divine Catholicity. For Lossky, orthodoxy is precisely this Catholic ecclesial consciousness. Writers as diverse as Bulgakov, Lossky, Meyendorff, Evdokimov, and Clement have employed this concept of orthodoxy or ecclesial consciousness in order to arrive at an expression which is neither triumphalist nor sectarian, neither disincarnate nor closed in on itself. Insofar as this notion of orthodoxy has been reflected upon and enriched by Christian culture, Orthodox Christianity as a cultural phenomena can be understood in the following way. On the one hand, Orthodox Christianity is a historical reality, symbolic in nature, characterized by acts, which manifest the lives of men and women who follow the path of Jesus Christ, by specific ways of thinking, which represent the truth as personal, always personal, and by organizational structures, which seek to realize the Christian kerygma. On the one hand, Orthodox Christianity is a self-awareness which determines the identity of different communities who profess to be Christian. Thus, the history of Christian orthodoxy is the narrative which tries to describe a Christian community's consciousness of itself in its sacramental, spiritual, and civic life. The history of revelation brought about by faith does not coincide with its reception, which is never homogeneous and always contradictory. This is why Nicholas Berdyaev wanted to write a critique of revelation, which would attribute to the Holy Spirit what Kant postulated of pure reason. The history of the Orthodox Church should be understood in its twofold significance. As a historical institution, 1, and a symbolic space. 2. House of the Father, body of Christ, temple of the Holy Spirit, bride of the Lamb, and so forth. It is therefore at once the narrative of the various representations that its faithful make of God, of the coexistence with it of often different representations of the world, and of the expression of the degrees of communion existing among its faithful. This is actually really good. Man. I'm sorry, Arjakovsky. The necessary historical redefinition of the criterion of truth. The love of wisdom, which takes into consideration the Trinitarian dimension of the human spirit and the tragic character of the history of philosophy, cannot ignore the theological process that posits the reality of God, radically other, yet capable of self-revelation as person. Conversely, because of the very content of the Christian faith, the orthodoxy of truth cannot be the exclusive property of the institutional theological discourse. This, of course, has political consequences, as was agreed in the debate between Joseph Ratzinger and Jürgen Habermas on today's post-secular society held on the 19th of January 2004. The Catholic cardinal insisted that everyone should recognize that the divine light of the reason can purify and regulate religions, and yet that history teaches us that reason also is susceptible to violent pathologies, the atomic bomb or the objectification of the person, if it is not reminded of its limits, and if it turns a deaf ear to the great religious traditions of humanity. For his part, Habermas situated himself in the same logic of a necessary new alliance in the public sphere between citizens who are believers and those who are not. Habermas states, "When secularized citizens assume their role as citizens, they have no right to deny a possibility of truth in the religious images of the world, nor to question the right of their fellow citizens who are believers to contribute to public debates using religious terminology. A liberal political culture can even expect secular citizens to participate in the efforts to diffuse, in public terms accessible to all, pertinent contributions originally expressed in a religious vocabulary." I don't know, man. That is lofty. There is therefore a reason for trying to redefine historically the implications of the contours of the notion of orthodoxy as a criterion of philosophical, theological, moral, and political truth. There are numerous publications in philosophy dealing with the truth, but few take into account the specific history of doxic thought in the margins of the progressive constitution of Western rationalism. In many respects, however, one can consider the history of the philosophical thinking of the 20th century, from Martin Heidegger to Michel Foucault and Stanislas Breton, as an effort toward its rediscovery. On the side of the theologians, numerous studies have been published which seek to understand orthodoxy as a historical, confessional, and ecclesial reality. One thinks in particular of the pioneering study Sieste de l'Orthodoxie by the three monks of the Abbey of Chevetoghe, Pierre Dumont, Filion Messiaen, and Clement Léaline, published in Brussels in 1944. Note, for Jean Danelou, what marks these pages is that they do not represent us with a historical orthodoxy. They do not present us with a historical orthodoxy, the object of retrospective studies, but with an orthodoxy which has to live with the problem posed by the new political conditions of the Russian state and the encounter with Marxist philosophy. Equally worthy of mention is Sergius Bulgakov's major postmodern work, L'Orthodoxie, translated by Lev Galet and published in Paris in 1932. This attempt at definition is taken up by many thinkers such as Paul Evdokimov, his son Michel Evdokimov, and many other authors. There are also many other comparable studies which seek to define the orthodoxy of the magisterium or that of the Protestant hermeneutics. But to the best of our knowledge, there has never been a study which tries to define the place of orthodox thought in the entire history of Judeo-Christian civilization. The study of orthodoxy, and orthodoxy more generally, is at the junction of philosophy, history, theology, and the sciences. It is by following the semantic history of this symbolic notion that we will attempt to define a new synthetic intelligibility for orthodoxy. This is a daunting undertaking, since it is a question of nothing less than a new representation of the truth which synthesizes the understanding of Christian revelation, the narrative of historical incarnation and the epistemological implications of that revelation, and certain developments in contemporary philosophical discourse. Note: the word orthodoxy or truth will not be capitalized, given that, from the outset, it has been indicated that there is the possibility of elevating the meaning from that of a quality to that of a subject. The word will be capitalized only in specific cases when the concept is only clear in its institutional signification. This is why it is fitting to first make mention of this question of the definition of orthodoxy and its place in the complex doxic system of modern thought. As a second consideration, our method for recovering the paradigmatic meanings of orthodoxy will be presented, exposing a semantic history of the concept of orthodoxy, situated at the crossroads of two major axes of truth: the horizontal and cosmic, and the vertical and transcendent. At this point, emphasis will be placed on the criterion of truth in the history of Christianity. Finally, the third, more historical and more detailed part of the study will rely on a historiographical study of the Orthodox consciousness in the works of the principal historians of Christianity in both East and the West, in order to demonstrate the constitution of four major paradigms of orthodoxy in the history of humanity since Jesus Christ. So the book should actually be titled, What is Little Orthodoxy?